And welcome to Let 'Em Talk. I'm Paul DiRienzo. Got another great show in store for you. And my guest sitting with me here in the studio, Richard Stratton, author, poet, editor, colleague of mine. We were both editors at different times. Or you were the publisher, actually. I was editor-in-chief at one time of High Times magazine. And you have written several fascinating books, at least two I know of, and I think many more, about your experiences. And the most recent one is behind us on the screen, Kingpin, right? Prisoner of the war on drugs.
Right.
And so you are what I would call a political prisoner, a prisoner of war. And, you know, I've worked with many people who've been through the mill and tried to help them because I, of course, believe that all drugs should be legalized. Nobody should ever go to prison for drugs, in my personal opinion. I don't know if you share that opinion, but for darn sure, nobody should ever go to jail for marijuana.
Well, no, I agree. I think all drugs should be legal. It's just ridiculous. All you do by keeping them illegal is enrich and embolden criminals. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I mean, drug use is a medical issue and should be handled by medical professionals, and it's not and never should have been a criminal justice system because that doesn't work.
Right.
It doesn't work. I mean, as soon as you make something illegal, all you do is raise the price and embolden people to bring it in and make a lot of money in the criminal underworld. Mm-hmm. That's all.
And that's what's happening. And it makes you wonder, because people do it or are so quick to do it, are they doing it for moralistic reasons, or are they doing it because the authorities are making money doing it? You know, there's a lot of corruption going on, a lot of palms being greased to allow it to come in. So imagine everybody's making money. At least that's what Prohibition was like in the 20s.
Well, and it's like that now. I mean, look, the country of Mexico is basically in an outlaw state being run by narco-traficantes. And the only reason is because drugs are illegal in this country. Right. So we've enriched them. We've created these narco-traficantes, these huge drug lords that wage war with violence, and you know, we sell them weapons, we buy their drugs, and we create this situation where all we're doing really is hurting our culture, hurting our country.
Right. Tell us your story. How did you, your book is called Kingpin Prisoner of the War on Drugs, and the implication is, since you wrote it and it's autobiographical, that you were one time a prisoner of the war on drugs. This is some years back, and now you've written a couple of books about that experience. Is this story an autobiographical story, or is it a fictional type story based on your experience?
Completely autobiographical.
Yeah.
I was arrested in 1982 and ended up serving a total of 8 years. I got out in 1990. My original sentence was 25 years with no parole. Fortunately, actually, I was sentenced in 84. Had I been sentenced in 86, I would have had a mandatory life sentence with no possibility of parole under what's known as the Kingpin statute.
So you were lucky that it was 2 years earlier.
I was lucky that it was 2 years earlier, and I was also lucky that I had a judge who decided that she was going to enhance my sentence for my refusal to cooperate. So she ended up giving me 10 years, but then she ran it consecutive to a 15-year sentence that I was already serving. And she said, the reason I'm doing it is because you refused to cooperate with the government.
I see.
And that ends up being illegal. That makes the sentence coercive rather than punitive. So I became a jailhouse lawyer and ended up appealing the sentence on the grounds that it was coercive rather than punitive, and the Second Circuit Court of Appeals ultimately vacated my sentence and remanded me for resentencing before a different judge who put my two 15 and 10-year sentences together. So I ended up getting out after 8 years.
Oh, I see. So basically, you were lucky. You slipped in there. What do the laws state now? Because now we have a lot of states that have legalized it in various degrees, but they haven't legalized bringing a lot of pot into the country. Right.
And you know, it was the feds. I mean, even though it was a federal case.
Yeah.
I was tried in the Second Circuit here in New York City, in a federal court in Manhattan, and sentenced under what they call the 848, the Continuing Criminal Enterprise Statute, which is called the Kingpin Statute, where I get the title for my book.
Right, right. How did you go back to your? How did you get involved in marijuana? When did you first? Did you smoke marijuana or just sell it?
I did indeed. I started smoking marijuana actually in my senior year in high school, which was 1964. Mm-hmm. And in those days, it was still thought of, there was a lot of propaganda, the weed with roots in hell. It was still coming out of the whole kind of the propaganda that was started by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Harry Anslinger, and
that you would go crazy, like these little black and white movies that they had at the time of marijuana, weed from hell, as you said, where people go crazy and murder each other and things like that.
Right, you smoke a joint and you'd be playing the piano like a maniac, and then you'd run out in the street and rape young girls, and then the next thing you know, you'd be shooting heroin.
Right.
So I remember, I mean, in those days, in the early 60s, and we used to, our idea of having fun was to go out and drink beer and get drunk and then get into fights and, you know, vandalize places, chase girls, the American way. So I remember the first night I ever came in contact with marijuana, we were out driving, we went to this place where we usually drink beer, and we had a case of half and wrapper private stock in the rear, and my friend brought out a joint, and he said, let's try this. We were all like, oh man, that's marijuana. You smoke that stuff, and it's gonna, you know, who knows what's gonna happen?
Right.
But we were all like, okay, let's go. You know, let's try it. So we smoked this joint. I'll never forget. We passed it around the car, and we were listening to the radio, and LBJ came on the radio to talk about bombing North Vietnam. Wow. And we were high for the first time ever in our lives, and we sat there listening, and we thought, what is this? It was just so different. All of a sudden, it was like, this guy, who is this guy? He sounds like Uncle Cornpone, you know, and he's talking about bombing North Vietnam. And we were, of course, of that age where, you know, we could have been been there, right? Yeah. And friends of ours had gone. So it all seemed so different. And we thought, wait a minute now. And then, you know, what happened was we began to think in that time, look, if they would lie to us about this plant, they would lie to us about the war in Vietnam. They would lie to us about who killed JFK. Right. We began to question everything that the government had been telling us all these years. And it really became more of a cultural revolution, really, that
Where did you grow up? Where did this happen?
Wellesley, Massachusetts, you know, which is like 15, 20 miles outside of Boston. It's a very upper middle class, WASP town. In those days, when I grew up there were no blacks. There were no Jews, actually. No Jews were allowed to join the country club. It was a very Anglo-Saxon.
No Jewish lawyers in the room, as we heard from Judge Roy Moore's wife earlier today.
But then, of course, it changed. My senior year in high school, they started busing kids in from Roxbury, and it all began to change. I went to Arizona State University on a wrestling scholarship, and that was how I started getting involved in smuggling pot.
Arizona.
Right,
that's near Mexico.
Near Mexico.
In those days, that's where it came from, right?
Right.
It was. We didn't have what today, where we have people growing it at home and in fields in California and Oregon and all these places.
Yeah.
Right? And much higher quality. Right?
It was really what I call and what the government called the so-called hippie mafia, which is what my first book is about, Smuggler's Blues, True Story of the Hippie Mafia. The hippie mafia was basically a bunch of loosely connected organizations of people who were bringing pot into the country and supplying this huge demand for marijuana in the 70s and 80s. Sure. And they were loosely connected, did not deal hard drugs, no cocaine, no heroin or anything like that. Marijuana and hashish, psychedelics later on, you know.
And it would come from Mexico, basically, into
most
states
of it
like
came
Arizona.
from Mexico, and then Colombia started out. And was the early days of High Times.
Right. And Colombian Gold was the better quality.
Colombian Gold was the better quality, right? Yeah. Which nobody even knew what it was in the beginning. Yeah. One of the reasons
I still don't know what it was.
Right. One of the reasons that High Times was started was to try to get people more aware of the different kinds of pot that were coming.
So did you know Tom Prasad back then?
Knew him well, yeah. Tom and I were in business together.
I see. So Tom Prasad is the founder of High Times magazine, and I'm not sure if this is accurate, but in some ways he's considered sort of the person who really invented trafficking marijuana in large quantities.
Well, he was one of them. He was one of them. I mean, Tom was, but there were a lot. I mean, there were guys from California. There were guys all over the country who were doing what Tom was doing, and Tom had the genius to see that this wasn't just a business, it was more of a cultural revolution. Right. You know, as I often say, it was the largest example of criminal and civil disobedience probably in the history of mankind.
The narco corazon, right? The songs, right? Canciones, not narco canciones. In Mexico, they have songs about it, but it started in the United States. They were honoring people who were bringing the marijuana in.
Right,
There was
right.
music and bands and concerts honoring people.
Yeah, it really changed, as I say, it changed the culture of this country and the world. And then, you know, one of the very typical examples of how this war was waged is the example of John Lennon.
Yeah.
And John Lennon, there was a guy, in fact, you probably know about this guy, John Sinclair. Do you remember John Sinclair?
Okay. I haven't seen him recently, but yeah, of course I know him.
John Sinclair was doing a 10-year sentence for possession of a few joints.
10 for 2, as the
10
song
for
goes.
2,
10,
right.
10 years for 2 joints.
And John Lennon heard about this and wrote a song and then went out and performed the song at a benefit concert. And within weeks after that, John Sinclair was released. And the government said, whoa, wait a minute. Look at the power that this man has.
Right.
So the next thing you know, they're trying to deport John Lennon for his possession of cannabis bust in England
many years before.
Many years before, right.
They're trying to dredge that up as a reason.
So that becomes, I think, to me, an example of how the government, the Nixon administration, used the marijuana laws to persecute and go after certain people that they saw as being a threat to the
and has that
political
come
regime.
out recently? That's actually come out recently that in the Nixon tapes and people who have worked with Nixon have testified now that and written that they specifically said they were going to use marijuana to go after the radicals and the anti-war people.
The hippies, right.
It was their drug.
Right. There's a great quote from John Ehrlichman where he talks about that.
Yeah.
We're going to use marijuana and the pot laws to go after the hippies and the freaks who don't like us, and then for the blacks, the other problem, we'll use the heroin laws, and I actually use it in the front of the Kingpin, that quote from...
Yeah, let's talk about your books now. Kingpin it just recently came out in May, right? And it's the second book, really, of the two. The first volume is Smuggler's Blues.
Right.
And this is Kingpin. So do you want to begin with Smuggler's Blues and how it relates to this book, or do you want to begin with this book and tell us a little bit about it?
Well, we can start with Smuggler's Blues, because Smuggler's Blues really tells the story that we just talked about. How I first got high when I was in high school, how I went to Arizona State on a wrestling scholarship, started smuggling pot across the border, very small amounts, but then it became larger and larger and became involved in what we called the hippie mafia. And then became a target of the DEA.
Right. Was that guys, or was there women involved too?
No, there were a lot of women involved.
A lot of women. So it was like the first real opening, because if you look at every movie from Prohibition, there was hardly any women with girlfriends. That was it, the mall. But it was different in this era, right? Women.
Yeah, no, there were a whole group of women who were out of Laguna Beach that were connected with the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, which is a big organization that was out of Southern California. They were bringing in a lot of hashish, and the women would travel all around the world and bring the money and bring the pot.
Using their charms to slip by.
Using their charms, right.
They were effective in those days.
Yeah.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. So then what happens to you? What brought this all crashing down in your life?
Well, I had a long run, basically 15 years of running in that world and being involved with the so-called hippie mafia, and getting bigger and bigger and bigger, where we started to bring in huge loads either by plane, or ultimately we developed a means of what we called the commercial smuggle. And the commercial smuggle, the idea behind that was that you go to a country where they have a product that is exported to the United States, and you buy a huge amount of that product, and you hide your hashish or whatever it was, marijuana hashish, in with that.
With the tortillas or something like that.
Yeah,
or whatever it was.
Yeah, right. And what we did was that during the first war between, what they call the Gulf War, they couldn't buy these dates that came from actually from Syria and from that part of the world, Pakistan, these little dates that they use in cake mixes and stuff like that.
Right. And this is the Iran-Iraq War in the early 80s.
Right. The so-called Gulf War. Yeah. So we found a company that was a legitimate company here in the United States that imported huge amounts of those dates. And I went over and bought a lot of them, the dates, I mean millions and millions of pounds of those dates, had them shipped to to Lebanon, and then I hid 15,000 pounds of hash in with the dates and sent it back to this country in 7 containers.
On a ship, was that, I got one of those. I remember that.
Yeah.
I was in college when those appeared.
Lebanese hashish.
Yes,
Right.
yes, and they came
From
in
the
little
Bekaa Valley.
the canvas sacks, right?
Canvas sacks.
I remember that.
With the stamps on them
Oh
and
my
everything.
God.
Yeah.
Okay, I was wondering where they came from.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now I know.
Lebanese blonde and Lebanese red.
Not that I ever sold or anything,
Of course
but
not. Of course
I'm
not.
familiar with that though.
Yeah. So that was the big commercial smuggle that we more or less brought into existence, where we would bring it in by air freight at
Yeah.
Logan Airport in Boston or at JFK here in New York,
Uh-huh.
and we would bring them in by containers on ships.
I see.
We had a bonded warehouse in New Jersey where the containers would go and we would take our product out. A lot of times we would sell whatever it was,
Yeah.
like the dates or the other products that we were bringing in.
Sure. I see. And then how did the DEA get wind of all of this? I mean, it seems so big. Maybe you were getting a little bit big for your britches there.
Well, they knew about us because of High Times was one of
Yeah.
the things. I mean, I was very closely connected with Tom and with the early days of High Times. So they knew who we were,
Right.
but the way they actually busted me was, it's funny because I had one of my sort of personal rules was never get involved with anybody who's either using or selling cocaine.
Yeah.
That was like a personal rule that I had.
Right. It made people crazy.
Well, it made people crazy and it made people sloppy. It brought a lot of heat on you,
Yeah.
and it just was a drug that brought about violence, and people got addicted
Yeah.
to it. It was just nothing that I wanted anything to do with.
Sure.
But I broke my own rule when I had a huge load of Colombian pot come into the state of Maine. We had a freighter, a Panamanian
Oh my
freighter
God.
off
A
the
freighter,
coast.
right.
It was like 40,000 pounds of
God.
pot.
You really were a kingpin.
Yeah, and what happened was I needed help. I needed stash houses. I needed transportation, and I knew a guy that I really liked and felt a lot of sympathy for. But I knew in my heart that he was using coke,
Yeah.
and ended up using him. He helped me to get some stash houses and stuff.
Yeah.
And after like 3 or 4 days, I was taking him home, driving him home.
Yeah.
We were going up the hill. It was snowy, and there was a car that had slid off the road.
Oh.
And I had a 4-wheel drive truck, and I pulled over to help this guy get his car out of there.
Sure.
And that was a DEA agent
Oh, really?
who had my friend that I was dropping off under surveillance.
Oh.
And he saw me, recognized me, knew who I was, got in touch with the headquarters and said, Stratton is in the area. He's dropped off this guy, and that was how it all began.
I see.
By breaking my own rules. Had I not been with that guy that day,
Yeah.
I probably would have gone along a lot longer than that. But
Right. Right.
that just goes to show you, if you have certain values and certain ideals, don't go against them.
Okay. Follow your principles.
Yeah,
right.
follow your principles,
Right.
exactly.
So how did the arrest come down?
The arrest came down about 4 or 5 days later. I knew that something was wrong.
Yeah.
I could just feel the heat gradually around me. And then I started to see these guys driving around. Fortunately for me, we got the whole load in, we got it all distributed.
Yeah.
And I was on my way home back to this farm that I owned, actually up there with Norman Mailer at that time. And I thought, something's wrong. I don't want to go home because I feel like I'm going to bring the heat to my home.
Yeah.
And I remember going to this restaurant in the morning. I stayed at this motel, went to a restaurant in the morning, and I walked in and I saw a bunch of guys that I knew who were at the sheriff's department. And they knew me, they knew who I was, and I was friendly with all local law enforcement. And they saw me and they kind of looked away like this, and I thought, oh, this is it. I went into the men's room, I took any papers that I had that were like, could be incriminating, ripped them all up, threw them, and I thought, I'm going to get arrested any minute now. I just knew it. I walked out of the restaurant, and instead of getting into the car that I was driving, because I figured they were going to arrest me, I walked down the street about a half a mile, went into a drugstore, and made a phone call, and called a friend of mine, said, you better come pick me up. I think I'm about to be busted. And then I went into where they had a bunch of video games in the back, and I was playing this video game, a bunch of kids standing around. Next thing you know, we look up, and like 15 DEA agents came into the restaurant, and they surrounded me, and there were guns on me.
Oh, the whole thing.
Yeah.
Oh.
And the kids who were watching me, they were like, wow, look at, they were so blown away.
It was a real life
Yeah,
video
real
game.
life video game. So that was my the first part of my arrest. I ended up making bail, $250,000 bail. I jumped that bail within a couple of weeks. As soon as I found out that the guy that I had gone to drop off was going to cooperate with the government, tell them everything that I'd done. So I figured I'd better go on the lam. And I was on the lam for almost 2 years, mostly in Lebanon.
Yeah.
And then I was living in Hawaii. And they arrested a Lebanese guy in New York City whose father was, I was very close to his father. And they kind of lured me back in. I got arrested in Los Angeles, in the airport of Los Angeles.
Right, and they brought you to New York to put you on trial.
Brought me to New York, brought me up to Maine, put me on trial in Maine.
I see.
Gave me the maximum, which was 15 years. And then I was on my way to the penitentiary. They pulled me off the bus, and they said, we got another case for you. I said, what do you mean another case? I just got 15 years. They said, well, we're going to charge you under the Kingpin statute. So they charged me, and I went to trial again in New York City and got convicted again.
Okay.
And then the judge gave me 10 years, which was the minimum. But she said, the reason I'm going to run it consecutive with the 15
right
year
after, like make it 25.
Right, make it 25 was because you refused to cooperate with the
Instead
government.
of concurrently, which is usually what they do in these type of cases, right?
And really, the one that they were after was Mailer, because Mailer and I were close
Norman
friends.
Mailer was, tell me about Norman Mailer's, and we don't, there's such a big story, we have to have you on again, but tell me about the Norman Mailer. How were you connected with him?
You know, way back in 1969, I was a fellow at the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, a writing fellow. And Mailer lived across the street. And the woman who lived below me in the apartment building below me was his cook.
Yeah.
And she and I became friends. And she said, oh, you got to meet Norman. You guys would love each other. And I met Norman. Norman invited me over to his home, and we became close friends. Ended up owning property together in Maine. And the government was convinced that Mailer was somehow involved in my smuggling activity, which he wasn't. I mean, Norman smoked pot, and he was probably one of the first writers of any real repute to write about pot. He wrote about, he wrote a great essay
Before
called
Hunter S. Thompson.
Before Hunter Thompson, before anybody, really. Maybe some of the old beatniks were writing about it, but he wrote an essay called General Marijuana, about his own experience with marijuana. And he was, you know, on the Nixon enemies list. He was marched against the war in Vietnam.
All his books, and his books about armies of the night and all that stuff, where he really reamed these government people, right?
Right, exactly.
Anti-war treatment.
When they put us together, they figured, well, if we can get Mailer and lock him up. You know, in those days, they were doing a lot of busting people of repute that they could bring in. John DeLorean, they set him up, and you know, they really wanted to get Hunter Thompson. There's a bunch of people that they wanted to
send a message like, you see, we'll get a big guy like this who everybody's attention is on, and that'll send you the message that. You know.
And it will discredit that person. You know, who's going to take these bunch of hippies, you know, anti-war movement, and you know, it's because they're all smoking pot. That's what's wrong with them.
Right, back in those days. Now every conservative person, I mean, it's the conservative people who are getting it legalized now in all these places.
Yeah.
You know,
that's
cancer is a great decider. You know?
Yeah, and
it's good for cancer. I just had a friend who never could in her life imagine the idea of smoking marijuana. I mean, the person, not against it, but the idea of it even being anywhere within 100 miles of this person would have been a crazy story. And she lives in Florida, and she has cancer, and the doctor said, it's legal here, you should get it. And so she's calling me up, how do I get it? And I said, look on the internet at the Florida Department of Health.
Yeah, because Florida's legalized.
Right, they 75% voted for it, a very conservative state. And she is on the internet now, you know, with the state of Florida, they're helping her get it.
Well, you know, that's one of the most amazing things about this plant. In the beginning, when the whole legal cannabis for medical use started, I think a lot of people thought, oh, that's just an excuse because these people want to smoke pot. And they didn't realize or didn't believe how valuable it is for many different medical ailments. I mean, it's phenomenal how many. It's really a wonder.
She's taking it for the chemo. It helps with chemotherapy and keep your food down, and it helps you deal with all the chemo and radiation. Has an amazing effect, better than anything. And now they're saying the marijuana itself has anti-addictive, anti-cancer properties. Retards cancer cell growth. And
yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, actually, in Israel, they're doing some of the most cutting-edge research of all the different effects that the different cannabinoids have for arthritis, for all kinds of different things.
It's opening up. It's a whole
yeah,
different
it really
change.
is.
Yeah, Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, wants to turn the clock back on all of this.
That's the most bizarre thing about it, is that just how the federal government will still refuses to change the scheduling of marijuana. It's still scheduled along with dangerous drugs. It's not. They still haven't agreed that it has medical use. So the scheduling is still out of control. And it's
we got a couple of minutes. This is your book. It's on the screen behind us, Kingpin, Prisoner of the War on Drugs. You can get it. I mean, I got this picture off of Amazon, so it's available everywhere.
There you go.
Widely available. So anybody can get it and read more about your stories. Last couple of minutes, what is a kingpin exactly?
A kingpin, for me anyway, is anybody who is sort of the leader of a group of people involved in smuggling hash or marijuana or what have you. That's what makes you a kingpin as far as the federal government is concerned. They're the ones who called me the kingpin. You know, they hit me with that moniker. But
they didn't have a specific law at that time, or they tried to later get you under that law.
No, they had it. They had it. It came into, it was called the Continuing Criminal Enterprise.
I see.
And it was the Kingpin statute.
I see.
848, which was the designation for it. Yeah.
So we only have a minute left. What was jail like for 8 years?
You know, actually it was a fascinating experience from a lot of different reasons. I mean, it was tough. It was really hard. The hard part about it is that you're separated from the people you love, and that's the real agony of it. You know, that the whole world is going on out there and there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah.
So you feel that isolation terribly.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it's a really interesting time because you have a lot of time to think about yourself and all of the mistakes you've made and what you're trying to do with your life and what life is really all about. And you meet a lot of fascinating people. So, I mean, it was an interesting, really interesting experience, and my book is really all about that. It's all about
that's where to go and get the rest of the story, so we don't have to reveal all of that. We led you up to the book. Now you should get the book and read what you're saying, go into detail of how jail actually turned into a positive experience for you. As it allowed you to change your life.
Absolutely.
Right. Richard Stratton, thanks a lot for joining us on Let Them Talk. It's a fascinating story. We have to have you on again to talk more about this. And it's one of my favorite subjects, and we'll talk about it more, especially our experience at High Times and all the other things that happened. So thank you. We'll see you next week, and have a great holiday. Happy holidays to everybody out there.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you.
Appreciate it.